The 1988 political conventions were held in New Orleans and in Atlanta. The Republicans went to the Superdome in New Orleans, which was a huge facility. They used only about two-thirds of it, curtained off the rest. And the Democrats went to Atlanta, where they held their convention in the Omni, and also over in the Georgia Dome for the media. The Omni held about 16,000 people. Do the math. You had 4,000 delegates, and you had about 12,000 media. So there wasn't any room for basically anybody else in there. And in point of fact, I got locked out the third night of the convention myself. I had brought some friends over to have dinner, and I had some extra credentials. And we never got back in. But also, a congressman from Oklahoma was jumping up and down. I got to get in, and I got to. Well, he didn't. So anyway, the Republicans nominated George Bush and Dan Quayle in New Orleans. They were coming off 8 years of very successful Ronald Reagan administration. Reagan ran into some problems with Iran-Contra from '86 on, and by all accounts, maybe he wasn't. He was fading a bit by 1988. But Bush had very little problem winning that election. He won with 53.4%. The announcement of Dan Quayle, who was a senator from Indiana, was made by grandly coming across the Mississippi River over to the Riverwalk, so basically a shopping center in New Orleans. And I'm sure others knew it was going to be Dan Quayle, but until Quayle got off the boat, I had no idea who the vice president was going to be, vice president nominee was going to be. And after he got off the boat, I still didn't know. Who is this guy? There was some interesting stuff that went on around the 1988 election. When Bush was nominated in July or August, he was way behind Michael Dukakis, and Dukakis' running mate was Lloyd Bentsen. Lloyd Bentsen, by the way, looked every bit. He's out of central casting. He had a good voice. He was a senator from Texas, and he just looked the part. And Lloyd Bentsen was pretty widely respected. Dukakis, meanwhile, he was had been governor of Massachusetts. He decided that he would put on a helmet and ride around in a tank to show that he was kind of manly, and it was just a disastrous picture. And Bush and the boys, the Republicans, were just starting in on this guy. Bush's campaign in '88 was run by a fellow by the name of Lee Atwater, and I watched Atwater in action at kind of a scrum of reporters, which I was in, and he was kind of cornered at some point off the convention floor, and they were talking to him. This is a tough guy, and pretty ruthless. And it is argued that George Bush lost in 1992 because Lee Atwood, who was a young guy, had unexpectedly died in the 4 years between '88 and '92. But Atwater cooked up arguably one of the meaner campaigns. Dukakis had allowed a fellow by the name of Willie Horton, who was a horrible human being, and he managed to get out of jail in Massachusetts under a program which Dukakis backed. And as soon as Willie Horton hit the streets, he went on back to raping and robbing, and he was on furlough. And so Bush, but really through Atwater, who had an instinct for these things, hung the soft on crime around Dukakis, and Dukakis sank like a rock during the fall campaign. The Superdome where it was held in New Orleans, of course, is still there. And I was staying over in the French Quarter, and I had been warned not to walk over to the Superdome, that it wasn't safe. It's 1988, folks. And so I didn't. My sister had flown out from Los Angeles, and I had extra credentials, and she was along with me at the press party, which were always enormous events and held by the host committee of the various places. A fellow by Wolfgang Puck, who had Spago in Los Angeles, and I never heard of the guy, and I heard of Spago, of course, and later when I was in Hollywood, of course, I would dine in Spago, and Wolfgang had a way of coming around and saying, "How you doing, big guy? How you doing?" And kind of worked the crowd at lunch one day when I was there. But anyway, I didn't know who this guy was. They were handing out Wolfgang Puck cookbooks and so on. My sister was just over the moon. She was so excited about this. The convention itself was pretty foreordained. The press site was adjacent to the Superdome, of course, where the press wasn't then as enormous for these events. So you had 12,000 people showing up, credentialed, to cover 4,000 delegates. We'll do the math, so forth. And as I walked over, I walked past this sort of comely young nurse. They were running kind of a off the floor kind of first aid place, okay. And so I stopped. I talked to everybody, and I said, "Well, what are you doing here?" And she said, "Well, we're giving out, if somebody collapses, we're here, and all that kind of business." And I said, "So what are you equipped to do?" And she said, "Everything from aspirins to enemas." You go, "We're done." Jesus, I don't know if that was true or not, but I had it on. Over in Atlanta, the Omni, where the actual convention was held, only held 16,000 people. And as I just said a moment ago, you can't get everybody in there. And I don't want to criticize the Democrats overly, but you got to look at these things and say, well, you want all your people to come in from around the country and get all excited and have a night watching in the convention. You put them up in the eaves, and you got to get the press in there, and you got to get the delegates in there, and you can't get everybody in there. And so this was a mess. The other thing that I recall about this was one day I'm over, I don't know, I'm out on the street doing some coverage on one thing and another, and I'd go to different governors and senators and so forth would have little press conferences, and they would speak and so on. So I was darting from one to the other, and as I did, I ran across this group of Nazi sympathizers on one end of the street, and the sort of the pro-Israeli group. I forget the name of these groups, and they were obviously about to get into it. And of course, you want to be there when they mix it up, right? But I had to be somewhere else. So, so I took off and I went where I was doing. And when I came back, there's nobody here, And well, it was. I mean, as I call CNN, NBC, a couple of network people that I maybe knew. I said, "Where'd they go?" I said, "Well, look down the street." I said, "There's a big crowd down the street." I said, "Is that them?" I said, "Yeah, that's them. They're down there talking with our camera people and so forth to see where we want the Nazis and the Jews to be, what the best camera angle and so forth. And then when everybody's kind of get here, then they'll be ready. They'll come back up and they'll scream at one another. Cut. That's exactly. It was negotiated out between these competing groups. Folks, that's not the only time this happened. This happens a lot, or did happen a lot, and I bet it's still happening, where the media itself sets this stuff up and goes from there. George Bush, a little factoid about George Bush. He was only the fourth vice president to ever be elected directly from vice presidency to the presidency. John Adams, 1776, Thomas Jefferson in 1800, and Martin Van Buren, little known fact, in 1836. And then George Bush. So it doesn't happen. And by the way, electing people out of the Senate, sitting senators, didn't really happen either. Normally we would choose them from the governors and so forth and so on. And then Obama comes along and was a sitting senator in 2008, and of course he won. And John McCain was in the Senate, so that kind of rule has in more last couple of decades gone by the no longer true. Now, if you want to go see the Omni and you want to go see the Georgia Dome where the press was, they're gone. They've been leveled. And I kind of collect these places. So I went some years later to where the 1948, both conventions were held in 1948 in Philadelphia, in the Philadelphia Convention Hall, I think. Yes. And it got torn down in 2005. It was a wonderful Art Deco building, 1931 and so forth. But I had talked to a fellow reporter who had been covering the conventions for a very long time. And he had been sent out to cover things. First convention, 1948, had TV. Not much. There were not many TV stations, but nonetheless, with TV. And he said he took his family and everybody went out for 3 weeks in Philadelphia and et cetera. And so I got into this building years later and walked around. This fellow, it was empty, and a film crew had been in there, and they were stealing this wonderful Art Deco stuff. It was a beautiful building. And he walked me all the way through it, and I photographed it and so forth and so on. But it was pretty clear that this wonderful building it had been acquired by an adjacent hospital medical center, and they were going to tear it down, and they did. If you go looking for other venues, you can find where John Kennedy in 1960 was nominated, and it's called a sports something or other in Los Angeles, adjacent to the Los Angeles Coliseum. And if you really want to see it, there's a motion picture called The Best Man, which was photographed and shot inside that building. So you can have a look at that if you want to. But other places where, like for example, in Detroit in 1980, Ronald Reagan was nominated, and the convention was held in Joe Louis Auditorium or wherever it was. And when I returned to Detroit a couple of years ago, and I went looking for this because I walked through this place again. It's just a big open lot. It had been torn down. So there's a lot of these sort of what I consider historical places where these great events were held are gone. But I found one, I think it was up in Boston. I don't want to say where it was, but it had been some conventions in the I think in the 1850s were held there, and that one's still there. Not always easy to get into these places because they're not people don't kind of they're all locked up and sort of that happens there. This was a pretty foreordained outcome. It was pretty clear Bush was going to win. Dan Quayle was a nice guy, let's just say. But Bush said something that really struck a chord in his acceptance speech in 1988, which came back to really get him and made me chill on the guy. Bush thundered, no new taxes, and the crowd went nuts in his acceptance speech and so forth. No. But in 1990 or 91 or so, Bush raised taxes. Bush struck a deal with the Democrats, and they raised the taxes. Well, you can argue, and I think it's probably true, that they needed to raise the taxes, and they need to, we need to do a better job, and we still really do a better job in terms of running and funding our government. But people were really unforgiving for Bush having been so definitive that he wouldn't raise taxes, and then he turned around and he did. The other interesting thing I think about this is Bush carried California. And in those days, I remember reading, California is a solid Republican state. It won't come back. Well, whatever happened there. And that was pretty much it. A nice, easy conventions, plenty of room in New Orleans, a charming city. In those days, I considered New Orleans one of three great American cities: Boston, San Francisco, and New Orleans. And I consider them that way because people who lived there really loved their cities. Well, New Orleans was ravaged by the hurricane some years ago, and probably hasn't recovered. I've been back a time or two. Still have friends there, but doesn't too well. And Atlanta just continues to grow and grow and grow. And there is one last story to tell about my congressman, a fellow named Mike Sinar, who I was out on the convention floor, and Mike was very unhappy. I've been an early supporter, and Mike was very unhappy with me because my newspapers by that time had become critical. Mike had become very liberal, and he's from Oklahoma, a very conservative state, and he just had. So we got into it on the convention floor a bit. We sparred before. And the following morning, I'm over having breakfast with members of the delegation, and just kind of listening to them, and one of them says, Sinar's dead man walking. He's not gonna survive. He's lost touch with everybody, and that was all around the room, Well, that was my sense of it too. And he did lose in the nomination 6 years later, and he died not long after that. So he had some, and a very young man, he had some issues. I think it was a brain issue or something or other, which caused him to become not the great politician that he had been earlier. But I remember that morning, Mike himself showed up and sat down, and everybody, hey, Mike, how you doing? Well, he was unaware that he was in a hostile group who were not going to be supporting him anymore. That's the 1988 conventions. We're working our way slowly through this. By the time I reached Atlanta in 1988 and New Orleans, I was a pretty seasoned guy by then. I'd been to 5 conventions, Kansas City in 76, and both the 80 and 84 conventions. I would not work in TV again after 84. And I was beginning to, the Senate Press Gallery, who credentialed daily newspapers, and I was working on somebody else's daily newspapers credentials and feeding them a little bit of stories, was getting to know me, and eventually I kind of think eventually I would, by the time we get out to 2016, I'd probably been doing this stuff longer than almost anybody else. That's it. The next one will be 1992, which was a great one, the conventions in 92. And we'll get to that next.